Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here with you all. I want to say that I found my career here in the state of Florida. After I got out of the Air Force, I was going to college at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and I was just ready to graduate, just right there. And I got asked by the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez's union, to quit college and come to work for the union here in Florida, organizing fruit pickers. And so I did. And that's how I became an organizer. And from there, I went on to, as you said, work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice for many years, and then on to work for the global network that I work for today, which is made up of about 150 affiliated groups all over the world who are saying, hey, we don't want these U.S. Star Wars bases in our community. Because all over the planet, the United States has now put these what are called downlink facilities, these bases that talk to the satellites, that are developing the capability to spread warfare across the planet using space technology. When the U.S. launched the shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003, in that initial attack, 70% of the weapons that were guided to their targets were directed by military space satellites, most of which are launched from Cape Canaveral, right here in Florida. So people around the world are saying, we don't want our community to be a part of this U.S. Star Wars program. And so our challenge then is to get our own citizens in this country to begin to stand up and say, we don't want to create a whole new arms race in space. Well, we are indeed lucky at last, aren't we, that George W. Bush, after 8 years, is gone. A sigh of relief we can all breathe. And while he was in office, you know, he doubled military spending. Doubled it. He walked away from the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, that outlawed the testing and deployment of so-called missile defense systems. And Bush began a massive expansion of NATO that is now moving eastward to surround Russia and even China. NATO has become the military arm of the United States of America. In fact, this year is the 60th anniversary of NATO. And this coming April, just next month, there are going to be massive protests in Strasbourg, France, where NATO will be holding its 60th anniversary events. And peace groups from all over Europe will be joining together to protest this NATO expansion that is happening today. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, Bush got the United States into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our two oil wars as we call them. In the case of Iraq, it's obvious. They have oil, right? And we've built 14 permanent bases there, or what the Pentagon likes to call enduring bases. I remember a few years ago, Hillary Clinton, at that time a senator from New York, was in Iraq. She was making a tour of Iraq and Afghanistan, and she was on the Sunday morning talk show. You've all heard it. It's called Phase the Nation. And this is what I heard Hillary Clinton say. She said, we're going to be in Iraq a long time. The American people need to relax. We've been in Korea for 50 years, she reminded us. And President Obama, our new president, in a speech just a few weeks ago, actually days ago, delivered to the Marines at Camp Lejeune, said the following, quote, we will retain a transitional force to carry out three distinct functions: training, equipping, and advising Iraq security forces, conducting targeted counterterrorism missions, and protecting our ongoing civilian and military efforts within Iraq. Initially, this force will likely be made up of 35,000 to 50,000 troops, unquote. Well, considering the presence now in Iraq of about 140,000 U.S. Civilian mercenaries, military contractors they're called, it appears that after 2010, August of 2010, President Obama intends to maintain a military force of nearly 200,000 Americans who will continue to conduct counterinsurgency combat operations. While the Obama plan will have, admittedly, fewer U.S. soldiers involved, it won't really change the reality for the Iraqi people. They will continue to die from the use of deadly U.S. ground and air weapons. Obama has also just very recently announced a 4% increase in military spending for the year 2010 in the amount of $663 billion, an all-time American record of military spending. In fact, more money than the entire world combined. When you add up all the military budgets of every country in the world, we are now, in 2010, going to be spending more than everyone else combined. In fact, Senator John McCain, I think you've heard of him before, was quite pleased with Obama's Iraq announcement. He said the following, quote, "The President's plan, as it was briefed yesterday, is one that can keep us on the right path in Iraq. I worry, however," he said, "about statements made by a number of our colleagues," he meant in the Senate, "indicating that we should aim at a troop presence much lower than 50,000. And McCain went on to say, "I believe that the administration should aim to keep the full complement of 50,000, as briefed by Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen, and not succumb to pressures, political or otherwise, to make deeper or faster cuts in our force levels," unquote. Well, it's interesting to know that Mr. McCain, who many voters, probably including some of you here tonight, feared would win the election. Many people voted for Mr. Obama because they feared John McCain would win the election. But now, as it turns out, McCain is also happy. And he's happy also, I think, because his good friend, Robert Gates, remains as the Secretary of War. Now, Afghanistan, where the Pentagon has built 6 new permanent bases, doesn't present quite such an obvious case for the U.S. staying there and expanding that war, because they don't have oil, do they? Our new president, in fact, says that he's there to chase and find Osama bin Laden. So they have no oil, but if you study a map of Central Asia, what you find is they sit right in the heart of what Zbigniew Brzezinski calls Eurasia. And in his book called The Grand Chessboard, Zbigniew Brzezinski says the following, quote, "For America, the chief geopolitical prize is Eurasia. And America's global primacy is directly dependent on how long and how effectively its preponderance on the Eurasian continent is sustained," unquote. U.S. bases in Afghanistan, bordering Iran and Pakistan, very near Russia and China, give the United States strategic advantage in the region. Again, to quote from Brzezinski, he says, "The primary interest is to gain geostrategic depth through political influence in Afghanistan, and to deny to Iran the exercise of such influence in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, and to benefit eventually from any pipeline construction linking Central Asia with the Arabian Sea. Now, it should be remembered that Zbigniew Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. And he was also, come to find out, a chief foreign policy advisor to our new president, Barack Obama. Let me read to you a quote from another American by the name of Stephen Rosen. Stephen Rosen was the director of the neoconservative Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard University. He worked for the Defense Department, for the National Security Council, and was a professor at the Naval War College. He was also a founding member of the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, that we all know that many of the Bush administration people came from. In an article published in the Harvard Review, Rosen said the following: "The future of war and the American military, in that future, our goal is to maintain our imperial position and maintaining imperial order. Now we're in the business of bringing down hostile governments and creating governments favorable to us. Finally, imperial strategy focuses on preventing the emergence of powerful, hostile challengers to the empire, by war if necessary, but by imperial assimilation if possible." I want to read something else to you from the Department of Defense themselves, a report they published about 2 years ago. The report was called "Transforming the Way the Department of Defense Looks at Energy." Now, this is a very important report, I believe, because it really lays out what the American military strategy will be in the coming period. And the report, the DoD report, says the following: "Current planning presents a situation in which the aggregate operational capability of the force, of the military force, may be unsustainable in the long term. Implementation of the Bush Doctrine requires that our forces must expand geographically and be more mobile and expeditionary so that they can be engaged in more theaters and prepared for expedient deployment anywhere in the world. To ensure itself a reliable source of oil in perpetuity, the Pentagon will increase its efforts to maintain control of foreign sources of supply, especially in Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates." Some people call this the New World Order. Others call it corporate globalization. This New World Order is characterized by fierce international competition for declining stocks, declining supplies of oil, natural gas, coal, uranium, and other precious resources. MIT professor Noam Chomsky says that our foreign policy today is now all about controlling most of the world's oil supply as a lever of world domination. One way to keep Europe and China and India and other emerging markets dependent on us and in sync with our policies is to maintain control of the oil spigot that they're reliant on. In other words, the U.S. wants to hold the key to the world's economic engine. China today imports 80% of its oil through the Taiwan Straits. Thus, it's no coincidence that at this very moment, the United States military is in a process of doubling our naval presence in the Asian Pacific region, giving it the ability to choke off China's importation of oil through the Taiwan Straits. In the town I live in, Bath, Maine, we have a shipyard there called Bath Iron Works, where they only build one thing, the Aegis destroyer, that is being outfitted with so-called missile defense systems, and is now being deployed in Japan, South Korea, Australia, possibly even Taiwan, just 90 miles off the coast of mainland China. And the job of the Aegis destroyer is to take out any one of China's 20 nuclear missiles that they have that are capable of hitting the United States, the west coast of the United States. They have 20 of those capable of hitting our nation. And so in a first strike attack of China, they would, of course, fire off whatever was left in a retaliatory mission of their 20 nuclear missiles capable of hitting the west coast of the United States. And the job of the Aegis destroyer then is to fire a missile and hit these Chinese rockets soon after they're launched in what's called their boost phase, where they're easily visible, very slow as they're getting off the ground, and easy to go after. In fact, of all the missile defense systems, the one that is having the greatest success in their testing program are the ones on board the Aegis destroyers. Now, some people might say, Bruce, you're getting a little paranoid. The United States would never launch a first strike attack on another sovereign nation. It's illegal under international law. Well, after Iraq, we all know that that is official policy of the United States government. And in fact, at the United States Space Command, they've been annually wargaming a first strike attack on China for the last several years. Set in the year 2016, the United States launches a first strike on China using what's called the military space plane, the successor to the shuttle that is now being developed. Takes off like an airplane, flies to the other side of the world in 1 hour, and drops a devastating attack on China before returning home to base. This is the reality today of what's going on. And so as a result, China is saying, you know, we've got to be a little more creative about how we bring oil and natural gas into our country, because the U.S. is doing what it's doing in the Taiwan Straits, trying to develop the ability to choke off our importation of oil. So let's build some pipelines across, coming from the Caspian Sea, across the landmass of China, bringing them along the land. When you go home, look at the map and see where Afghanistan sits. Right in that Eurasian center that Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about, where we would then be able to control the building of pipelines and deciding which direction they might go. The U.S. is also now moving to encircle Russia. Bush proposed to deploy missile defense systems in Poland, a Star Wars radar facility in the Czech Republic, telling the world that they were intended to protect Europe from attacks by Iran. American professors of physics studied those particular deployments, proposed deployments in Poland and the Czech Republic, and said the only missiles that they could capture or hit would be those from Russia, not at all from Iran. As the United States now moves to create an encirclement of Russia, the question for all of us today is, how is President Obama going to rule on these deployments in Poland and the Czech Republic? 70% of the people in the Czech Republic are opposed to the U.S. putting a Star Wars radar facility in their country. But why does the United States want to encircle Russia? Why does the United States want a new Cold War with Russia? Doesn't make any sense. Well, as it turns out, Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas and significant supplies of oil in their country as well. The U.S. has recently built new military bases in Romania and Bulgaria, and is now moving to build them in Albania. NATO is now expanding into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, right on Russia's border. It would be the equivalent of Russia or China putting military bases in Canada, in Mexico, and ships on our east and west coast. Imagine how the American people would react, the American government would react if that was happening. But we're doing the reverse, and most people in our country don't even know about it. And if they do know about it, most of them think, well, why not? We're the good guys. The recent Russia-Georgia war, you might remember that. The media finally acknowledged that Georgia actually started that war by attacking Russian peacekeepers, initiating that war that, by the way, was largely supplied and directed by the United States of America. And the very first American dignitary, politician, to go to Georgia after that little dust-up happened was none other than, at that time, Senator Joseph Biden, who went to declare our undying loyalty to Georgia and threatening Russia once again. This was even before he became vice president. Noam Chomsky writes about this Georgian war. He says, quote, "The group of 8 industrial countries issued a statement condemning the action of our fellow G8 member, Russia, which has yet to comprehend," the statement said, "the Anglo-American commitment to non-intervention. The European Union held a rare emergency meeting to condemn Russia's crime, its first meeting since the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which elicited no condemnation," unquote. The Rand Corporation, you might remember the Rand Corporation. That's the place where Daniel Ellsberg was working when he made copies of the Pentagon Papers, that secret document talking about how the United States fabricated the pretext to get into the Vietnam War. And his conscience was bothering him. And he released it to the New York Times. It was a book that I read while I was in the military that helped liberate me, if you will, from a life of militarism. Well, the Rand Corporation recently has done a study suggesting that Russia be broken up into 3 separate countries so that the U.S. oil corporations and the British oil corporations might have easier access to control them. Imagine how Russia feels today as they look out and see themselves being militarily surrounded by the U.S. and NATO, and hearing that the Rand Corporation has a study to break them up into 3 separate countries, like was done essentially to Yugoslavia, and like Senator Joe Biden suggested we do to Iraq. Break them up into 3 separate countries. We should remember that as the former Soviet Union collapsed, Mikhail Gorbachev made a concession that was astonishing at that time. He agreed to allow a united Germany, East and West Germany together, to join NATO, which for the Russian people was, a big step. He agreed on the basis of assurances that NATO would not extend toward the East, not 1 inch, quote unquote, not 1 inch, said former Secretary of State Jim Baker to Mikhail Gorbachev. Bill Clinton, once in office, quickly reneged on that promise, and George W. Bush further expanded NATO eastward. And all signs are now showing that Obama will continue this policy. One has to look at his choice of General James Jones as National Security Advisor. General Jones was the former head of NATO. I'll talk more about him later on. And you might have heard just earlier this week, I believe it was on Monday, Joe Biden went to Europe to a NATO meeting where again he pledged America's undying loyalty and support towards NATO and NATO expansion. And now in our own media back here at home, we consistently see Russia portrayed once again as the raging bear on the loose, beginning to ramp up the American people's fear and animosity towards Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, recently speaking at a forum in Sweden, said the following, quote, "If Obama pursues the same policies as Bush, this would be a catastrophe. Obama must be careful. He must not deceive his people. Obama must end this new Cold War. After 100 days in office, we will remind him." Not only is NATO expanding globally, but the U.S. has also recently created a new command called Africa Command, or AFRICOM, where the Pentagon says we will be fighting 20 years for their oil. On C-SPAN several years ago, I was watching a presentation by a commander of the National Guard, of all the National Guards in America. He was speaking to the Right-Wing Heritage Foundation. He had a huge map of Africa. And he was pointing out how that every single National Guard from every of our 50 states in America had been assigned to a different African country. And their job, each state National Guard's job, was to go to that particular assigned African country and develop what are called lily pad bases. Quick interventionary lily pad bases set up so that the military, U.S. military, can move in quickly at the slightest show of disobedience to the empire, that we can enforce U.S. military dictates quickly through this new structure. And you know that countries within Africa, Nigeria and others, have significant supplies of oil and other resources for our cell phones and our computers. Many of the resources that are used to build these electronic devices are today mined in Africa. And so there's going to be fierce competition to control Africa and its resources in the coming years. And so AFRICOM, its job will be to ensure that the U.S. is dominant in Africa. The Pentagon has been saying for some years now that under corporate globalization of the world economy, every country is going to have a different role. China is going to make things, India is going to do certain things, Indonesia is going to do certain things. And they say, we in America, we're not going to make things. We're not going to be an industrial society anymore. We're not going to make cars or shoes or clothes or refrigerators. Our role, the Pentagon says, will be security export. So it's no coincidence today that in America, our number one industrial export product is what? Weapons. That's right. And when weapons are your number one industrial export product, what is your global marketing strategy for that product line? That's right. The more war, the better. The more war, more profits. And so they say at the Pentagon that young people in America aren't really going to have jobs anymore. And so we don't really need a draft because we have an economic draft. Kids' choices are flip burgers. Working class kids won't be able to really go to college. I was just in D.C. 2 weekends ago, and I read in a local paper that the University of D.C., a working class college, was doubling its tuition. And that students were camped out on the lawn in protest because they knew that coming from their working class communities, higher education was now being put out of reach for them. Just in February, 651,000 jobs were lost in America. Jobs that we will not likely get back because we have no industrial base in America anymore. Even with this new stimulus package, building some roads and fixing some bridges, I'm sure all of which needs to be done as our infrastructure is collapsing across the country. But after that is done, what are people going to do for work? Build weapons or join the military? Is it any wonder that at Sears, have you heard that at Sears they've started a new line of clothing for children? Army uniforms. Oh yes. They got a whole Army line of clothes at Sears. I couldn't believe it. So I went to our local Sears in the town next to where I live, and what did I see but this new line of children's Army wear, beginning to create the consciousness of a militarized culture. Endless war. Our job under corporate globalization, security export, begin to indoctrinate the youth that this is all you can be. This is all you can be. And how will we pay for this? The Pentagon actually has an answer for that as well. Last year, the Air Force started a public relations campaign called Air Force Overall. You might have seen the ads on television or in the New York Times, full-page ads. Air Force Overall. That reminds me of something. Do you remember a similar slogan? Deutschland über alles. Germany overall. And interestingly enough, one of my friends in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a Vietnam veteran, was at the VA clinic in Albuquerque, waiting to go in. You know how you wait at the VA clinic, and he got Agent Orange contamination in Vietnam, suffering effects from it today. And he's waiting, and he's thumbing through the base newspaper that's sitting there. And the base newspaper, Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, it's called the Nucleus. And there's a story called Installation Commander Addresses Kirtland National Strategy Issues. And come to find out, the base commander, Robert Summonsby, had just met with 300 Albuquerque civic leaders for a luncheon. And in that luncheon, the colonel said the following: if left unchecked, the growth of spending on Social Security and Medicare will eventually crush the defense budget. Unquote. And of course, he went on to make an appeal that there has to be reform of the entitlement programs. Now, Colonel Summonsby was not just out on his own making such brash statements in the community. This was part of this larger Department of Defense public relations campaign to begin putting in the minds of the American people that we have to create a culture of responsibility here, folks. You know, we now have a budget crisis. Everybody's got to do their share. There has to be cuts across the board. And the entitlement programs are eating up the budget. But of course, we all know that the Pentagon has had a firewall built around it. And you're not allowed to cut the military budget, even though it's doubled in the last 8 years and still growing. So you have to go after what's remaining. And what is remaining? And so is it interesting that just days ago, I heard those words again. Fiscal Responsibility Summit. Our new President Obama organized a Fiscal Responsibility Summit, at which time he said that we must restructure the entitlement programs. Ooh, what does that mean? What's going on here? Who are we talking about? What are the entitlement programs in America today? Officially, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program after Bill Clinton got finished with it. These are the programs that now must be brought under control. Fiscal responsibility. What does this say about the soul of our nation? When we have to have endless war in order to create jobs for the workers in our nation. What does it say about us as a people? That we have to have endless killing wars in order to create jobs for people in our communities. That in my state of Maine where I live, the Aegis destroyer being used to surround and provoke China today, is supported by the Republicans and by the Democrats equally across the board in my state, by the liberals and the conservatives, because it's jobs. It's jobs, and we need jobs. We can't cut the military budget because it's jobs. Although we're sitting and watching social progress be dismantled right before our very eyes. How can 48 million Americans, including me, who have no health care, ever hope to have health care when the Pentagon eats up 54 cents out of every one of your federal tax dollars? And the recent health care summit held by President Obama in Washington just days ago kept the single-payer health care advocates at arm's length as the insurance corporations have the ear of our new president. But health care is a human right and should not be a commodity in a capitalist society. We should not issue health care based on profit. In fact, it's a human right as basic as water and food and air is to our lives. Once again, some would say to me, Bruce, relax. Relax. Don't worry. Obama, he's going to be all right. He has a secret plan. He's just waiting for the right moment to spring the secret plan on everyone. And he's really just like a fox drawing the corporations into his lair. And then he's going to create the change that we're looking for. You know, what kind of change? I asked my friends who tell me that. As a candidate, Barack Obama said he would oppose the Panama, South Korea, and Colombia free trade agreements. He said he would oppose NAFTA. And he would go back and rewrite NAFTA. But just last week, Reuters news agency reported on a declaration from Secretary of Treasury Tim Geithner, said that the president will work with Congress to move forward on the long-stalled free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. You might remember right before the election, one of Obama's economic advisors went to Canada and was heard on a microphone telling the Canadians, oh, don't worry about what Obama's saying about NAFTA down there in Ohio and Michigan. Don't worry about it because he doesn't really intend to really rewrite it at all. And just right after the election, President Obama went up to Canada and basically told them, don't worry, I'm not going to really touch NAFTA. We're going ahead. And now we all wonder about what will Obama's foreign policy ultimately be. But I think there are a few clues available to us today based on his recent cabinet appointments. And let me just talk about a couple of them. Take Secretary of Education Arne Duncan from Chicago. He's been an advocate of privatizing public schools in Chicago. The school system now has 3 schools run by the United States Army. It has an Air Force school and a Navy school. All of these are in poor minority communities, where again the message to the working class kids is, you have no other option. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, the home of the Air Force Space Command, the aerospace industry is setting up a space high school to indoctrinate students on the value of U.S. military control and domination of space. This is from our Department of Education. Obama's choice for National Security Advisor, I mentioned earlier, retired Marine General James Jones, who was the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and is a huge advocate of NATO expansion. Right after Obama appointed General Jones, I was watching on television MSNBC News. And the reporter Chuck Todd was asked, tell us about General Jones. He said, well, actually, many people believe General Jones should have been the president because he's so smart. He's a dear friend of John McCain, the reporter said, and it was demanded by Robert Gates that he would only take the position of staying on as Secretary of War if Obama agreed to bring General Jones in to be his national security advisor. And in the last month, the Washington Post on 2 occasions has reported in lengthy articles that Obama is giving General Jones and the national security as national security advisor expanded powers greater than any ever had of anyone in this post before, putting not only the military, national security agencies, all under his control, but also putting Homeland Security and the U.S. economy under the control of General Jones as National Security Advisor. Now that's interesting. Why the U.S. economy under the control of General Jones? And the reporter asked him that. And he said, well, the economy is a national security issue. Well, when your number one export is endless war, when your number one export product is weapons, I guess in a way it makes sense, doesn't it? That you're going to put the economy under the control of the military. And that's what we're seeing happen today in Washington, D.C. General Jones is also a big advocate of AFRICOM, Africa Command, and was on the board of directors of Boeing and Chevron, just like Condoleezza Rice. She was on the board of directors of Chevron. She also served, as you know, during Bush's tenure in office as National Security Advisor before she became Secretary of State. Chevron was a defendant in a federal court case in San Francisco related to the murder of activists in oil-rich Nigeria. The crime of those activists? They were asking the oil corporation to clean up their mess. The people were dying in Nigeria because of the tremendous pollution created by Chevron as they were exploring for oil, and to pay more of the profits to the Nigerian people. Another interesting Obama appointment is Dennis Blair. You might have heard of him, former Navy admiral. He was named by Obama to be Director of National Intelligence, DNI. Well, DNI is a fairly new position in the government. It was created after 9/11 to improve coordination among 16 agencies that comprise the U.S. intelligence community. Well, Admiral Blair was the head of the Pentagon's Pacific Command while in the Navy. And on Amy Goodman's show on Democracy Now!, they did a series of interviews with journalist Alan Nairn recently, who talked about Blair's key role in training, equipping, encouraging Indonesia's military during the period when they committed massive human rights violations in East Timor during the Clinton years. Bradley Simpson, an assistant professor of history and international affairs at Princeton University, has written extensively about Blair, and this is what he said, quote, Blair's apologetics for murder and torture by Indonesian armed forces in East Timor and his opposition to trials, international or otherwise, for the high-level perpetrators of mass violence offers a sobering indication of the positions he is likely to take as Director of National Intelligence. President-elect President Obama's choice suggests that he will resist, as Blair almost certainly will, demands for the prosecution of high-ranking Bush administration officials, much less lower-level employees in the Pentagon or the CIA for torture, rendition, and other crimes carried out in the name of the so-called war on terror, unquote. I was in D.C., as I said a few moments ago, just a few weekends ago, for a national conference that I helped organize. I was on the organizing committee with many other, about 16 other national peace groups across the country, trying to create a no U.S. bases campaign. in our country. Around the world now, there's a very strong international no U.S. bases campaign happening. And they met in Ecuador just a couple years ago. And one of the things that they talked about while in Ecuador is that the U.S. now has more than 800 military bases all over the world, costing you well over $140 billion a year just to maintain them. And what the people in Ecuador wanted to know, people like us, peace activists from all over the planet, what are the American people in the peace movement doing about closing down their bases? Frankly, it's not something we talk about very much in this country. And so we created this conference in D.C. a couple of weekends ago to begin to create a U.S. no bases campaign. And the keynote speaker at our conference was a guy by the name of Zia Mian, who's originally from Pakistan. He's now at Princeton University. And this is what he said in his speech, some of which. He said that right now, Obama's crisis is really a crisis of empire. He quoted Obama from his recent speech before the joint session of Congress as saying, quote, "We will not apologize for our way of life, nor will we waver in our defense of it. We will revitalize our military. We will retain the capacity to defeat any challenge. I will not hesitate," Obama said, "to use military force unilaterally." Obama promised a return to the American dream. But Zia Mian reminded us that you can't have the American dream without the American empire. He said that 50% of the American people today believe that reducing U.S. presence around the world would increase our security here at home. And so as we had 200 people at this conference in D.C. from 12 countries, we decided, yes, indeed, we must go out and ask the American people that we begin to lift our collective boot off the necks of the people around the world. Well, let me conclude with a quote from another time in American history, when we had an economic system that dominated our country, our culture, and our politics. Just as militarism today dominates us and our politics and our economic system. Let me read this quote to you and see if you know who it was that said it. "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." That was Frederick Douglass, a key leader in the abolition movement, the abolition of slavery. And just, you can imagine during the time of slavery, abolitionists would come together, and there must have been this feeling of despair amongst them that how will we ever get out from under this horrid, horrid system that we're under today? How will we ever do it? And Frederick Douglass reminded them that it will only happen if we make a bold demand and then we go out and organize around that demand. And so what is that demand for us today then, as we face this reality of militarism, endless warfare? Well, I would suggest to you it is the conversion of the military-industrial complex. As we face a situation with jobs leaving this country like rats off a sinking ship, going overseas where corporations can maximize profits, as we face the reality of climate change coming, the solution clearly is to take our money from the military-industrial complex and put it into not only social spending, but creating a new industrial society, an environmentally green industrial society. Why in the state of Florida can there not be a solar system on every house and business, literally every building in the state of Florida, and in Texas, and in California, and in Arizona, and New Mexico, and all over America, and even in Maine, solar works in Maine. Why can't virtually every building in America have a solar device on it, paid for with the money that we now spend on endless war? Imagine the jobs created all over America in research, design, manufacturing, installation, repair of a solar society. Last year I went to Nebraska, drove across the country with several others to our International Space Organizing Conference in Omaha, Nebraska, where STRATCOM, Strategic Command, is headquartered, now in charge of virtually everything. And we're driving through Kansas. In Kansas, the wind blows so hard it almost blows you over when you get out of a car. They call it the Saudi Arabia of wind. Why can't there be windmills all over there? The state of Kansas and other places around this country. 23 miles off the coast of Maine, in the Gulf of Maine, they say there is so much wind potential there they could create the equivalent energy of 10 nuclear power plants. Why at Bath Iron Works in my town, instead of building Aegis destroyers to provoke a war with China, why can't we be building windmills, wind turbines? Dealing with the effects of climate change, creating, I saw an article in the paper, 30,000 jobs just building 1,000 windmills for the Gulf of Maine. Imagine the jobs created, doing that all over America. What about building a rail system, connecting every corner of this country, getting us out of our gas-guzzling cars? Imagine the jobs created all over this country, laying rail, building rail cars. Incredible. Creating a new society, dealing with climate change, and giving us hope for the future. And one very important fact that we need to know is that military spending is capital intensive, and every other kind of production is labor intensive. The University of Massachusetts at Amherst Economics Department did a study in late 2007. They took $1 billion and they said, yes, it's true. When you spend $1 billion on military production, you do create 8,500 jobs. That's true. But they said when you take that same $1 billion and you put it into home weatherization, which we really need in Maine, I'll tell you that, you create 12,000 jobs per billion. Or if you take that same billion and you put it into building mass transit systems, you create 19,000 jobs. So which would we rather have? 8,500 jobs building endless war per $1 billion, or 19,000 jobs building rail systems? Which would the American people rather have? These are the kind of demands that we should be making together, friends. Thank you very much. There was an article in the Washington Post just a couple days ago that said that since the Democrats took control of Congress in 2006, they have spent more money on the military than the Republicans did. They have been getting more donations from the weapons corporations, from the military-industrial complex, than the Republicans got in the last two elections. That in fact, once the Democrats take power, we see that they do the same thing the Republicans did. They give a little more on domestic stuff. They say, yes, you can have butter, you can have more butter, but we're going to continue to give you guns. Well, our cry has to be, yes, we want the butter, thank you very much, but we don't want the guns. The Democrats are wedded to the military-industrial complex, and as soon as we figure that out, then we're going to really have change in America. But too many people say, oh, we elected a Democrat, great. The Democrats control Congress, great. Now they're going to take care of everything. I can go back to playing tennis again. It doesn't work that way. Now, one of the interesting things I'm watching right now is that Hillary Clinton was sent over to speak to the Russian Secretary of State equivalent recently to talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons and saying to Russia, we need to get rid of a whole lot more of our nuclear weapons. Well, just think of this. If you're Russia, and the United States is militarily encircling you with bases of its own, with NATO expansion, talking about the deployments in Poland and the Czech Republic, all developing the ability to essentially hit Russia in a first strike, are you inclined to contemplate giving up some of your retaliatory capability? Not really.
Not at all.
You're going to say, wait a minute, I'm not stupid. It's one of my wild cards. You want me to give away my wild card as you're encircling me? So watch closely this dynamic going on now, because what I think is happening, and it's just an opinion, but I think the United States is it's playing chess and is setting moves here by appearing on the world stage and before the American people, to be being very gracious and magnanimous. Yes, we want to get rid of nuclear weapons, and we've gone and we've talked to Russia and we've offered them a deal. And look, they've completely rejected our offer. Well, without seeing the entire context, right, of increasing encirclement and expansion of NATO and everything else, the American people are just going to say, yeah, those damn Russians, you can't trust them. We make an offer to get rid of nuclear weapons, and look what they do. We've got to go after them. It's okay. Go in and kick their butt. So we got to watch this, because this is a very dangerous dynamic that is underway today. I'll never forget this brilliant organizer in Sicily. It was a great story. He was having a hard time organizing the poorest of the poor in Sicily. And finally, he just gathered them together and he asked them, today I would like if we could just ponder this one basic question. What is the difference between us and a tick? And so he went back and basically started with their basic humanity. All right? What does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a human being on this planet? Do you have a right to clean water? Do you have a right to clean air? Do you have a right to health care? Do you have a right not to be sent off to endless war for corporations? And these are the kind of discussions that we need to be having in our homes, in our churches, in our schools, in the break rooms on our jobs, and everywhere else we can. And that is how I think we begin to recreate a culture in our country that can bring real change. Because until we move away from the business model, this indoctrination in this corporate-dominated system that we live in, we're not going to get anywhere. So that is what I hope for us all, that we each find a way throughout each day that we live, one small thing we do to begin to decolonize our mind and to create this discussion in our community. I think that's the long journey ahead for all of us. Well, thank you all very much. Enjoyed. Thank you. Bases that talk to the satellites that are developing the capability to spread warfare across the planet using space technology. When the U.S. launched the shock and awe invasion of Iraq in 2003, in that initial attack, 70% of the weapons that were guided to their targets were directed by military space satellites, most of which are launched from Cape Canaveral, right here in Florida. So people around the world are saying, we don't want our community to be a part of this U.S. Star Wars program. And so our challenge then is to get our own citizens in this country to begin to stand up and say, we don't want to create a whole new arms race in space. Well, we are indeed lucky at last, aren't we, that George W. Bush, after 8 years, is gone. A sigh of relief we can all breathe. And while he was in office, you know, he doubled military spending. Doubled it. He walked away from the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, with civilian mercenaries, military contractors they're called. It appears that after 2010, August of 2010, President Obama intends to maintain a military force of nearly 200,000 Americans who will continue to conduct counterinsurgency combat operations. While the Obama plan will have, admittedly, fewer U.S. soldiers involved, it won't really change the reality for the Iraqi people. They will continue to die from the use of deadly U.S. ground and air weapons. Obama has also just very recently announced a 4% increase in military spending for the year 2010 in the amount of $663 billion, an all-time American record of military spending. In fact, more money than the entire world combined. When you add up all the military budgets of every country in the world, we are now, in 2010, going to be spending more than everyone else combined. In fact, Senator John with Russia that outlawed the testing and deployment of so-called missile defense systems. And Bush began a massive expansion of NATO that is now moving eastward to surround Russia and even China. NATO has become the military arm of the United States of America. In fact, this year is the 60th anniversary of NATO. And this coming April, just next month, there are going to be massive protests in Strasbourg, France, where NATO will be holding its 60th anniversary events. And peace groups from all over Europe will be joining together to protest this NATO expansion that is happening today. Under the guise of fighting terrorism, Bush got the United States into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our two oil wars as we call them. In the case of Iraq, it's obvious. They have oil, right? And we've built 14 permanent bases there, or what the Pentagon likes to call enduring bases. I remember a few years ago, Hillary Clinton, at that time a senator from New York, was in Iraq. She was making a tour of Iraq and Afghanistan, and she was on the Sunday morning talk show. You've all heard it. It's called Phase the Nation. And this is what I heard Hillary Clinton say. She said, "We're going to be in Iraq a long time. The American people need to relax. We've been in Korea for 50 years, she reminded us." And President Obama, our new president, in a speech just a few weeks ago, actually days ago, delivered to the Marines at Camp Lejeune, said the following, quote, "We will retain a transitional force to carry out three distinct functions: training, equipping, and advising Iraq security forces, conducting targeted counterterrorism missions, and protecting our ongoing civilian and military efforts within Iraq. Initially, this force will likely be made up of 35,000 to 50,000 troops," unquote. Well, considering the presence now in Iraq of about 140,000 U.S. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here with you all. I want to say that I found my career here in the state of Florida. After I got out of the Air Force, I was going to college at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and I was just ready to graduate, just right there. And I got asked by the United Farm Workers Union, Cesar Chavez's union, to quit college and come to work for the union here in Florida, organizing fruit pickers. And so I did. And that's how I became an organizer. And from there, I went on to, as you said, work for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice for many years, and then on to work for the global network that I work for today, which is made up of about 150 affiliated groups all over the world who are saying, hey, we don't want these U.S. Star Wars bases in our community. Because all over the planet, the United States has now put these what are called downlink facilities